Hey everyone, I'm Zach. I'm the lead pastor here at Restore. Thanks so much for checking out this week's video. I hope that it encourages you and I hope that it inspires you. And I hope that you have some community around you to be able to talk through some of these concepts and truths with. If you don't have community like that, we would love to invite you to be a part of our community here at Restore. You can learn all about it on our website at restoreaustin.org. So click there and get all the information that you need. I hope that we see you soon at one of our gatherings, and I hope that you enjoy this message.
Good morning, everyone. I am here with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, and we are in our Summer Mixtape series. Beth, I am so excited to have you with us this morning. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
Awesome. Okay, well, if you don't know much about Beth Allison Barr has a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That's the most difficult part of this whole interview because I'm a big Duke fan. So
Well, let me help. I took almost half of my coursework at Duke.
Nice. All right, we're back. I'm in it. All right, here we go. And then Beth is an associate professor of history and associate dean of the graduate school at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, which we're going to get to hear about a little bit more in a second, women's history, and church history. She's also the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of the Christians for Biblical Equity group. Beth has written for Christianity Today, the Washington Post, RNS, and is a regular contributor to the Anxious Bench, alongside Kristen Dumais, which is another one of our summer mixtapes this year. And she also writes for the popular Patheos website on Christian history. Beth, I am, again, so excited to have you here, excited to talk about your work, specifically your latest book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which is just phenomenal. The subtitle here is How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. One of the things that's so striking to me about your book, and a lot of your writing that I've read, honestly, is, but specifically this, how deeply personal it is and how deeply connected it is to you, to your story, to your family's story, and even to your church background. And so most of the time I start out these summer mixtapes by saying, hey, could you just give us a, kind of an overview of your story, let people get to know you a little bit. But this time I actually want to ask you to kind of weave that in with how it fits into the main subject of the book, which to me really is that complementarianism. That's the belief that men have been ordained by God to be the final authority in every area of life, including the church, while women are called to fully submit to male leadership. That idea of complementarianism, according to you in the book, and I believe the Bible, isn't biblical at all. And so could you tell us some of your background and story, and then the story of coming to that conclusion, and then what happened after you decided to speak out about it?
Yes. So I've said this before, but the Making of Biblical Womanhood is really my life. It's all of my life. I was born and raised, I was a cradle Baptist, and grew up most of my life in a Southern Baptist church. I married a Southern Baptist ordained minister 10 days before I went off to Chapel Hill, and he started at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And even the fact that we did that, sort of thing, kind of talks about how much this understanding of gender roles was really kind of just in the background of my life. It was something that I knew was there. It was something I'd already felt the impact of it, both personally, where I got on the dark side of the really dark side of complementarianism. But at the same time, most of the men that I knew were good people, were people who loved Jesus. Most of the pastors I knew really cared about women. Women didn't preach from the pulpit, but that didn't mean that women were ignored in a lot. And I think this is sort of also with complementarianism in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, it was really a more, I don't want to say benevolent, but it was more a paternalistic type of complementarianism, if that's maybe a good word. Christianity Today just had an article about paternalism and patriarchy. It's all patriarchy, y'all. But a paternalistic one is mostly a little softer. And so when we started, it didn't really seem to hinder much of what I was doing when I started off. I felt the bad side of it, but not enough to make me really question it. I still believed it was true. I believed that's what the Bible taught. And it really wasn't until we began this journey together of being at Southeastern, when at the time when Paige Patterson was really in his heyday.
Yeah.
And we got married in 97. And so this was right when the Baptist Faith and Message was in the process of being changed. There had been some tweaks to it already, but it really is the battle between 98 and 2000 that leads to the significant changes in the Baptist Faith and Message, in which we get the family part inserted, where it says women are to submit graciously to the authority of their husbands. And then where we also get the clause that says that women should not be pastors.
Yeah.
And this is the one that's really, so these two things happen at the end of the 90s, right when my husband and I were starting our journey in grad school, me in a women's history, medieval history program at Chapel Hill, and him at Southeastern. And so we began pretty quickly to feel the changes. I mean, the fight with Dorothy Patterson on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention, that meeting, this was all over the news in Durham and I mean, you can imagine, it's because this is where it was happening.
Right.
These were the people, they were our neighbors.
Right.
My husband drove past their palace at Southeastern, when he would go to classes. So it suddenly became so vivid at the same time that I started really learning about the history of patriarchy. And one of the things that was so shocking to me when I talk about this moment in the book, but I remember vividly sitting in this women's history seminar. And it's kind of interesting because since I wrote the book, a couple of women who were in that seminar with me have reached out to me and been like, "Oh my gosh, Beth, I remember that conversation."
Yeah.
And, they had no idea what was going on in my head, but they remembered that conversation because we were talking about how the fact that what the Southern Baptists were doing was no different than what civilization had done since really the beginning of time.
Yeah.
This oppression of women, this idea that women belong under the power of men. Yeah. And one of the things that really came out in that seminar that semester was how this never goes well for women. Some women are able to flourish in it. These are usually the luckier women. These are usually the women who come from positions of better, they're better established families. They're middle class, have more money. They can live this life, and they are mostly have, paternalistic, benevolent men around them.
Yeah.
But for a lot of women, they can't live this life.
Right.
For most women in the world, most women are still often married, but most women's families cannot live on the income of a single person.
Right.
Most women have to work to support their children. Most women cannot, they have to put their children in daycare, or they can't afford daycare, which causes all sorts of other problems. So the reality is that patriarchy hurts most women. Even when men aren't abusive, it still hurts the livelihood of women. And it also limits their ability to follow God's calling on their lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these two parts really started congealing for me while I was in graduate school. I did not make the move, though. I didn't really start. It started troubling me, but I still adhered because, my thought was, but this is God's word.
Sure.
This is God's word. It must just simply be the way that we do it that's wrong. It must be sin entering into the church that causes this. So that was sort of my stance, that this is still, that if it's done perfectly, if it's done the way God calls it, it doesn't go badly. It's this beautiful image. I hear women talk about that. They're like, "Oh, but it's so beautiful." And I'm like, that's such a nice dream.
Right.
I know that now, but I believe that. I understand where they're coming from. And it really wasn't until my husband and I were knee deep in youth ministry. And I began seeing how this theology played out in the lives of the girls that we worked with, the lives of the boys that we worked with. And I also began to realize that as this theology plays out, I begin to see how it was hardening in the church. I mean, the late 90s and early 2000s is when we see the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood really coming into its full, it's not, I don't want to say glory, but into its height of power. This is also when, Wayne Grudem's systematic theology has kind of taken over conservative seminaries as being what's taught for systematic theology. This is when Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood becomes known as the Blue Book, the Blue Bible. It's original. And so, I mean, this is when everyone is gung-ho on board with complementarianism. And so what we see it hardening in churches, and churches that once tolerated women teaching or allowed or encouraged women to teach start turning away from that and start pushing women out. And it started getting really ugly really fast. And so I think this is when it was suddenly, I remember that and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I learned about in my history. This is what I learned happens, that this doesn't play out well for women. And it was also at this same time that I suddenly began to think more historically about Paul. Yeah. And what I was teaching, it really came, one of the things we know as teachers is that we don't really learn things until we teach them.
That's so
and
true.
Teaching women's history from the ancient world through the medieval world, I began teaching Paul's letters within the larger scope of what was going on in the Roman Empire. And I began to see things I had never seen before, such as the fact that Paul's overarching theology is about the church working together for the glory of the gospel. It's never about some people always getting to be in charge of other people. In fact, what Paul's always pushing against is being like, you think you're in charge, but let me tell you differently, that everybody's important. Everybody has to work together. Nobody gets to be the person who's always over. He's always pushing against that. He's always working towards not uniformity, but unity.
Exactly, yes.
And so I began to really see that at the same time that I also really began to see that women are all over the Pauline epistles. Women are all over the Gospels. And women are not playing the role of biblical womanhood. Mm-hmm. Women are not in, what is emphasized about women is not subordination. Yeah. What is emphasized about women is their ability, their faith, and their ability to share the gospel. I mean, Jesus tells the woman at the well, he says, go and tell others what I have done. I mean, he commissions her to preach. He says, go, and he doesn't say, oh, you can only talk to other women. He says, go and tell your husband. Go and tell the man that you're living with. Go and tell. And I mean, in some ways, that is a commissioning.
Absolutely.
Jesus commissions Mary Magdalene. Right. He says, go and tell the apostles. Yeah. And so, Jesus commissions women to preach, to share the gospel. Yes. Paul works with women who are sharing the gospel. And so I began to really feel like a hypocrite in my classroom because here I was standing before my students, showing them how women preached, taught, and led in the early church. And yet I was in a church that was pushing women out of preaching, teaching, and leading. Wow. And it suddenly all came together for me one day when I was like, this isn't biblical. Yeah. Yeah. And that began sort of the beginning of the end for my husband and I, our ministry at the church. It still took a few years. And sort of our goal, our thought is we are still making a difference. We are working within a system and we are making an impact. And I still believe we were, but it came to a point where we were no longer able to do that. Yeah. And where we had, sort of our only choice was to leave quietly, or as Jamar Tisby says, leave loud. Right. And even before I knew the phrase leave loud, that's essentially what we decided to do. We decided, and not that we were trying to split the church or do anything like that, but we decided not to go away without voicing our concerns and trying to make a change for the better. Yeah. And that ended up with us being fired. Wow. So, yeah. So there you are. That's my story in a nutshell. I interweave it throughout the Making of Biblical Womanhood parts of it, so you can get a little bit more of a glimpse of what was going on in my head as God was working on my heart.
That is beautiful and heavy at the same time, and I appreciate you sharing it. It is the little time period that you had in between, like you saying, okay, this is not biblical for sure, like I'm putting my foot down, and when you were let go, was your husband's journey inside of that time period?
So, as I said, my husband started this whole thing with me, and when he got to Southeastern, he actually got put off by the hardline stance he saw there. I mean, I tell some of his stories. I don't tell all his stories. He has a lot of stories, but I tell some of his stories. And one of his stories is when the professor in his classroom stood up and said, part of the syllabus part of what everybody has to do is essentially teach a biblical lesson. And he said, if there are any men in this class who are uncomfortable with a woman teaching, then just let me know and I'll make sure there's not a woman in your group. Wow. And I remember my husband coming home and being like, what if all of the men said that they couldn't let a woman teach? I mean, they couldn't do the assignment. Okay. And he was like, so he was upset. And in fact, one of the papers he wrote at Southeastern was on female ordination, and he took it from this is another thing that we found. We were running into these women who were at the seminary, and my husband, because he was ordained and because he was working at a church, he got a scholarship that paid for part of his tuition. But women who were also working at churches at the seminary were not allowed to get that through their churches. Because they weren't ordained. And he was like this, and that really struck. So he wrote a paper on it in Southeastern where he was like, he confronted the hypocrisy of that. And he still probably has it somewhere. The professor gave him a decent grade on it. I said, essentially, I understand your point, but here's all the reasons why you're wrong. Right. And anyway, but it still, so it shows that my husband wasn't hardline about this. And what he mostly taught on when he taught on it was mostly how Christ calls husbands to love their wives as Christ loves the church. And he always talked about how this has nothing to do with authority. He was like, this kind of blows up the idea that you control your household. Right, and so he'd always kind of taught on that. That's so I don't think he was all that far. He was kind of like me, where we were like, this is the way it's supposed to be done. We mess it up because we're sinful. Yeah. And slowly what we began to realize was, this is actually not what the Bible is teaching. So I think he was journeying with me. Okay. It wasn't always something we were talking about. I think it came up to the forefront for me a little sooner because of how I was teaching it. Sure. And because the cost for me was less. Yeah. I mean, he knew if he began teaching something different, it would go south for him really fast. Absolutely. And he eventually decided to make that choice. Yeah. But so anyway, he may have been a little bit behind where I was, but we were still kind of doing this journey together, which I've always been very thankful for. Yeah, absolutely. That's huge. I think when my wife and I have walked through different deconstruction, reconstruction phases around things, it's been good to be able to do it together. Yes. Yeah. So one of the quotes in the book that struck me really deeply is, you say, the reality is that biblical women contradict modern ideas of biblical womanhood. And that's actually how I changed my mind on women in leadership and gender equality, because I had a professor in college and my undergrad. I went to Hardin-Simmons out in Abilene, which is a Southern Baptist. It was a Baptist school, but not directly connected to the Southern Baptist at that point. And so we had to take a couple of theology classes. I was a public relations and advertising major, but we had to take a couple of theology classes. And I was a pretty, just grew up Southern Baptist, grew up in pretty fundamentalist conservative during the resurgence as well. And so that's all I ever knew was kind of hard complementarianism. And I just had a professor challenge us one day when we were having this kind of discussion about it to research women in the Bible. And he gave us a bunch of names of women. And I was like, oh man, he just, he just messed up. I'm about to go in here and find out all the stuff. And it was transformative. I read about
Jania and Phoebe and Deborah and Mary Magdalene and Mary and Martha. I mean, just over and over. I mean, it was mind blowing. And so I would love for you to talk through an example of this idea that biblical women contradict modern ideas of biblical womanhood.
So I really was excited about doing this, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is for, I don't really consider myself a preacher, but I think I'm pretty called as a teacher.
Yeah.
And I'll occasionally do a little bit of preaching. So I thought what might be fun was to talk a little bit about not only a biblical woman, but a biblical woman from a medieval sermon perspective.
Love it.
So I thought that might be fun. So I'm hoping that maybe your congregants will bear with me a little bit, because I'm going to read from some medieval Middle English sermons. I'm going to set them up for you a little bit. So I'm going to have them here. I have a little bit to read from, because even though I read Middle English, I don't keep it in my head. It's hard to memorize Middle English, so I'll just read it. But I want to start with, for those of you who want to open up your Bibles or have something at home, I just want to start with a very common passage that I think is very common to all of us. If you follow the lectionary, this is a Lenten passage. You still will often find it preached on the second Sunday in Lent. This is a medieval tradition, goes all the way back to the medieval church. So the lectionary is pretty old. There's variations in it, but a lot of it's still the same. So if you want, I'm going to start with Matthew 15, and I'm reading from the NRSV. I almost always read from the NRSV, but it's verses 21 through 28. And there's also a parallel passage in Mark, but the lectionary reading does Matthew 15. And so this is what it says. It says, Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting at us." He answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So one of the things that struck me about, I'm always reading different things on the internet. And one day, a few years ago, I found an article by the Missio Alliance, which is something that some of you may have pulled articles from. And this one was from 2014. I found it after that. I found it like in 2016 or 2017. But anyway, it had an article by a staff member named Gary Taylor. And it caught my eye because the title of the article was "The Woman Who Won an Argument with Jesus." And it's drawing from the parallel passage in Mark. But Taylor tells the story of the Canaanite woman seeking the healing of her demon-possessed daughter. And the initial response of Jesus, as we just read, was pretty harsh. This is actually a hard passage to teach. He says, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But the woman persists, okay? Nevertheless, she persisted. She responds that even dogs get to eat the children's crumb. And then Jesus says, "You're right," and heals her daughter.
Wow.
So Taylor asserts that this woman's request to Jesus insulted his honor. That even her approaching and doing this in this male space, that this was even the fact that she came, called out to him, followed him, and then when he essentially said, "Shut up," she, "I'm not for you," she comes and sits at his feet and says, "Lord," and keeps asking. So, women were considered inferior to men, not fully human. And so when Jesus, and this is a hard word, but this is one that scholars, that when Jesus turns, his response is pretty scathing. Some have called it racist, some have called it misogynist. And Taylor suggests that essentially what Jesus did was call her a bitch, which isn't a nice word. And a lot of people get really upset about that.
But dog, that's like, he calls her a dog. Yeah.
That's what he calls her. And so, the question, of course, is what is Jesus doing here? Yeah. We all get kind of upset about this passage. So what Jesus seems to be doing, what Taylor suggests, is that Jesus is putting out the perspective of what his disciples were thinking, what the men around him were thinking. He is challenging her. He's saying, look, you're, according to all of these people, as I'm reflecting, you aren't worthy.
Right.
He's challenging her to prove her worthiness, which she does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jesus looks at her and says, you're right.
Yeah.
You are worthy.
Yeah.
Your faith has healed you. I mean, this is really amazing. And so, from my perspective, Taylor's reading of this text isn't surprising. The goal of his article is to show the worthiness of women, that Jesus recognizes women as worthy. And as he writes, he says, what then are we as modern Christians to do with Jesus's seditious elevation of women? I like that word seditious there. He says, quite simply, we are to go and do likewise. Yeah. For too long, the church has been dominated by her masculine half, and she is desperate for her feminine side to make her whole.
Good.
I love that from that article. And, Taylor's not alone with this. Even Anne Graham Lott has argued the same thing. A lot of folk have argued this. And in fact, in my book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I briefly mentioned the woman of Canaan, and I mention her along the lines of this article. I call her the woman who won an argument with Christ.
Yes.
What's sort of funny to me is that I've gotten a lot of pushback from this statement about the woman who won an argument with Christ. The conservative Anglicans got really upset with me about this. It was sort of funny. And the claim is, what I have heard is, the people who have argued against this, they say, this is not a proper reading of this text. This is a very modern, progressive reading of the text that is fueled by feminism.
Of course.
And my response to this is, well, that's fascinating. Then why were 15th century sermons reading the text in the same way?
Oh, yeah. You brought all this from medieval times.
My response is that this is not actually a progressive reading. This isn't a feminist reading. This is a traditional reading rooted in church history that we can see and that I can see in medieval sermons. So what I thought I might do is show y'all some medieval sermons reading this text for just a few minutes. I won't get too technical for you. So let me just show you. So the woman of Canaan, as I said, she is the second Sunday in Lent. She's, in the lectionary text. So she's all over medieval sermons. In fact, people quote her all the time from medieval sermons. Chaucer talks about her from medieval sermons. He also talks about her in this seditious way. Chaucer's kind of pro-women. I don't know if you've read enough Chaucer, but he's pretty interesting what he does with women. Another woman I talk about in The Making of Biblical Womanhood also uses the woman of Canaan to talk about how Jesus always allowed women to speak, and that's Christine de Pizan. So we have, the use of the woman of Canaan and how she's used in medieval sermons shows up in medieval literature. Okay. Gotcha. So let me talk a little bit about some of the sermons. And, she appears in, and I've done this, I've gone through and counted how many times she appears in late medieval English sermons. And she appears in over half of sort of the sermon collections that we have. I mean, her story is really everywhere in medieval sermons. Medieval people would have known this. Yeah. And so one of the things, the way that she appears in these sermons is she appears not as a woman, but she appears as a representative of Christian souls, of both men and women. She appears as a gender, really as a representative of both men and women. Yeah. So for example, one of the most popular sermon collections in late medieval England is a text called Festial. I use it all the time. It has all of these, more than 40 copies of it exist, which means it was a medieval bestseller. Yeah. So this is how it tells the story. It says, this story is in Holy Church, a high example of each of God's servants. The woman of Canaan represents each of God's servants. And it says, the woman that come of afar to Christ is applied in the sermon to quote a story of a man that struggles with deadly sin, as well as a woman who struggles with deadly sin. So this medieval sermon, it tells the woman of Canaan, and then it shows how it applies to a man, and then it shows how it applies to a woman. I mean, she's gender inclusive. I mean, this is actually really fascinating.
Incredible.
Yeah, another sermon gets even more to the point with how she is gender inclusive. It says this, it says, by this woman of Canaan is understood every sinful soul that is infected with deadly sin. So long as the soul is subject to the devil and the devil leads it from sin to sin, then this woman of Canaan, who is sinful man's soul, must go out from the country of Tyre and Sidon, that is from sin, that he or she, that's what the sermon says, he or she is in, and forsake it.
Wow.
So the woman of Canaan becomes an exemplar of every sinful soul who needs to forsake sin.
That's incredible.
The sermon then actually goes, and this is one of the things I talk about in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. It then quotes the Bible. It quotes from Psalms. It quotes from Psalms 102:17. It quotes from it. Most medieval sermons actually draw from the Vulgate, which was the most common medieval Bible. But then what Middle English sermons do, because most medieval folk didn't read Latin. And so they quote from it from the Latin, and this is the English rendering of the Latin. It's Psalms 102:17, and it says, "He hath regard to the prayer of the humble, and he hath not despised their petition." Okay, so it uses masculine language. The translation of it in this Middle English sermon is, quote, God, first of all, it makes God not he. It says, God beholdeth the prayer of a meek man or woman and does not despise their prayers.
That's incredible. That's
the Middle English translation of Psalms 102:17. It's gender inclusive, referencing the woman of Canaan. And so, as I said, I mean, it's really amazing how this medieval perspective just changes how we think about gender inclusive language and even about biblical women. One of my favorite sermons, and this is a collection that I talk about in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. I've done a lot of research on it. I recently just published an article on this sermon, but it's a sermon collection that was written in the eastern part of England. It's called Longleat House Manuscript 4. And it's a collection of about 56 sermons that follow the lectionary, that follow the preaching throughout the year. And it not only has the same sort of gender inclusive nature of the woman of Canaan, but it does what Gary Taylor suggests and what, sort of modern complementarians claim is a progressive reading of the woman of Canaan. Okay. And so what it says that this woman, it presents the woman of Canaan as being so powerful in her faith that she changes the mind of God in a way that male apostles do not.
Wow.
Okay. I know. So I'm going to read you some of the sermon because this is really amazing. I quote from some of it in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, but I think, y'all, I get goosebumps whenever I read this sermon. It's amazing. So this is what the sermon says. It says, this woman whose daughter was travailed with the devil is understood to be every man and woman. So once again, we get that, whose soul, will, and conscience lives in deadly sin. Okay. In its insistence that right belief determines salvation, the sermon emphasizes how women assist with the salvation process. First, the text emphasizes the right belief even for Jews. It states that, quote, the Jews that believed in Christ were God's sheep and God's children, and so are all men and women of right belief. Okay, so it's emphasizing that even Jewish people in biblical times also became Christians. Okay, it then emphasizes that women are more inclined towards right belief. Okay, I love this. It moves from the woman of Canaan to Mary Magdalene.
Wow.
And it says, quote, I love this. It says, Mary Magdalene was the first messenger of life and of Christ's resurrection to the apostles who had fallen from the faith during his passion.
Oh,
that's what the sermon says. Yes, it says they had fallen from the faith during his passion.
Yeah.
And so she was the first that confessed the gospel to them and brought the disciples back to faith.
Wow.
That's what this 15th century sermon says. Isn't that amazing? And then it goes on and says she was the first that preached the faith in France. Medieval people believed Mary Magdalene went to France and preached the gospel and brought it essentially to the rest of Europe. And so she was the first that preached the faith in France. And in the new law, the blame of Eve is turned to bliss, and the sin of Adam is turned to happiness, and our woe is turned to joy.
Wow.
I mean, there's so much in that. It says, so according to the sermon, it was a woman who brought the apostles back to faith after the crucifixion of Jesus. But that's not the end, actually, of this amazing sermon. There's one more part to it. As I said, this sermon shows that how the woman of Canaan changes the mind of God. Yeah. So it suggests that the woman of Canaan's faith is so strong that Jesus listens to her and heals her daughter, even though God does not always answer prayers this way. So this is what it says. It says, quote, she prayed with great perseverance, for she rested not till Christ granted her what she asked. Also, she prayed with great shame and great peace, for she asked not for riches, nor for worship for herself, nor for vengeance on her enemies, nor health of her own body, but for God to have mercy and deliver the soul of her daughter.
Oh my gosh.
Sermon then said, I know, it's amazing. The sermon then says, unlike St. Paul, who cried for the prick of his flesh to be removed, and God, quote, would not hear his prayer. God, quote, granted the prayer of this woman. I mean, it's amazing. And so here we have not only in this medieval sermon, not only a woman who had great faith, but her faith trumped the faith of the disciples and even Paul, and caused Jesus to hear her and heal her daughter. So there's a biblical woman that I think we've missed, and we've missed it, and we missed it in a way that medieval people didn't. So I think we have to think about what are our blinders in the modern church that cause us to not see women the way God wanted them seen in the Bible.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, that was not one of the names given me by my professor.
No, you were the Syrophoenician woman.
No. Oh, yeah, that's powerful. There's incredible material like this all throughout Beth's book. And like I already said, I could not endorse it more. It is simply fantastic. I want to ask you two more questions because I want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah. Well, you let me preach a little bit, so thank you.
Well, hey, you're just in Waco, so you have an open invitation anytime to come down and preach at Restore, anytime you want. Okay, here are the two questions. So one is about Bible translations, and the other is about a book club that we're planning to launch.
Yeah.
This book club led by one of our female pastors after this. We're super excited about that. Here's what I want to ask you about Bible translation. So you said earlier you're reading from the NRSV. I teach mostly out of the 2011 NIV, the new one. But by far the most popular Bible when I was in college and seminary was the ESV, right? By far the most popular. Now I've moved completely away from it over the last decade or so. But you talk in the book about how the ESV translation actually came to fruition. It's an incredible story that not many people know. Could you tell us that?
Yeah, I've really been surprised by the response to this chapter of the book. Not that I'm mostly just surprised that so many people don't know this story. This is a story that I followed from the very beginning, because as I said, I think it was, for one thing, it was happening at a time that I was kind of paying attention to the news. This story really started breaking in the late 90s and the early 2000s. At the same time, we see this hardening of gender roles in conservative churches. And it was also when I started my graduate studies. And as I said, I started reading, as I've just shown you, Middle English sermons use gender inclusive language, and they translate the Bible in gender inclusive ways. And so I was hearing all of this uproar about gender inclusive Bibles as being a product of feminism and of leading people away from the gospel. And I'm sitting here thinking, 15th century priests aren't feminists. This isn't, and plus, Christians have translated the Bible gender inclusively before now. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I paid so close attention to this story. But essentially what we have happened is at the end of the 90s, we have Zondervan releasing a new version of the NIV, which is more gender inclusive. It is not gender inclusive about God. It is gender inclusive, simply some of the Greek words that are more gender neutral and translating them in more gender neutral ways. I mean, it's actually very benign. It's husbands, I mean, I'm sorry, not husbands and wives. It's brothers and sisters. If it says brothers, they say brothers and sisters. It says people instead of men. You know, I mean, men is a horrible, it's an English word that we claim means all humanity, but it really doesn't. Yeah. It really others women. But so anyway, so they change it to people. I mean, it seems, or human, it seems very innocuous. But people like exploded and got all upset about this and, you know, claimed that feminism was infiltrating the church, et cetera. And so in the early 2000s, the late 90s, early 2000s, some of the people who got most upset about this had a meeting. And I talk about this in the book. They had a meeting to put a stop to this. And they were Wayne Grudem, John Piper. These were all of the Focus on the Family, James Dobson, all of these people were in cahoots with this. And they got a hold of the RSV. They got permission to retranslate the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. The ESV is about 95% the RSV. Okay. It's mostly not changed. The parts they changed were for their agenda, which they call unapologetically complementarian. Those are their words. They said that their goal is to make it unapologetically complementarian, to make sure people understand that women are divinely called to be under the authority of men and not in leadership. So what they change in the ESV is mostly to promote this gendered agenda.
Oh my God. Okay. I just want to reiterate what you just said there. These men manipulated the Bible in order to promote gender hierarchy. They call it biblical manhood and womanhood, but they had to literally change the Bible in order to make it biblical.
Essentially, they do what they were accusing Zondervan of doing with the TNIV. And what the TNIV, the Today's New International Version, and what you preach from, the NIV 2011, is mostly the TNIV. Zondervan was like, ooh, let's just go back and keep those changes and just make it an NIV. And so it kind of was. So mostly what you're preaching from is the TNIV. And I'm very partial to the NIV. It's still the text that I mostly have Bible verses memorized from because I grew up on the NIV. But I've used the NRSV more because I find in academia more people use the NRSV. So I kind of go back and forth between the NRSV, the NIV, and then of course I read Middle English Bible. So I read and I still use the 1611 KJV. That's one of the Bibles that I use all the time. So anyway.
Wow. Well, I think one of the most egregious things in the ESV to me are the changes to Ephesians chapter 5. I actually preached on this a couple of years back. It's the chapter where Paul is bringing equity to the existing Roman household codes. He's kind of flipping them on their heads. He's actually pushing back against the cultural patriarchy there. And the authors of the ESV actually insert a subheading to not include Ephesians 5:21 in the household code section. They take that verse, which is submit to one to another, which is a mutual submission verse, and they put it in the section above to make it look like it's disconnected from the rest of the chapter. Yes. It's crazy to me.
Yeah. And I've gotten quite a bit of pushback about calling that to attention. I've gotten a lot of biblical scholars who've gone, very conservative biblical scholars who are like, but, there is a break in some of the early manuscripts. And I'm like, yes. Some of our earliest one, there's not a break. There is a space between the end of 521 and the beginning of 522. But I'm like, that doesn't mean that 522 still doesn't go with 521. It's the same verb, it has to. So anyway, it's crazy to me. I'm like, if you are, and it doesn't have any subheadings, and clearly the whole chapter belongs with 521. The emphasis of the whole chapter is 521.
It makes me so frustrated.
There's a lot we could talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. I'm going to ask you to close in a word of prayer. I know you have a special prayer picked out for us.
I do.
I'm excited to hear it. So we're planning to launch this book club on the Making of Biblical Womanhood. I'm wondering if you have any resources or advice for those leading in or participating in the book club.
Yeah, I do have a resource. My husband helped write discussion questions for the Making of Biblical Womanhood. You can find them on the Baker webpage for the book, and they go chapter by chapter. And so, and they're pretty good. So he's good at writing discussion questions. I'm not actually very good at it. So he did a good job. So I'm thankful for him. So go use his discussion questions. And I think that will help. The other thing is that I think there is a lot of my personal story in this book. And so I would just say, not only, of course, I want you to see the evidence that I present, but I also want you to think about how my story might be your story, or it might be the story of other women you know. Theology has implications. And we've got to think about how our theology affects lives. And if our theology has gospel implications, or if the end result of it goes against Jesus. And so I would just encourage you to think about that the personal effect of theology about women.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Thank you. Like I said, we could talk about this for hours, but I want you to know I'm so thankful for this book. I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for your voice. You alluded to this earlier, but people may not know that you have been receiving some significant hate from folks who feel threatened because of their patriarchal power is beginning to crumble beneath their feet. Jesus is using you to help do that. So I want to ask everyone who's watching this, please be praying for Beth and her family as they walk through this difficult season. What she's getting that I'm talking about, they're not critiques, right? I know Beth would welcome disagreements, critical readings, all of that stuff. But this is something different. This is hate, personal attacks, and threats, and they are just awful and sinful and wrong. And so, Beth, we want you to know that we are standing with you. We are praying for you during this time, and we are really, really grateful for your work.
Thank you.
So would you close us in prayer as we finish up?
Yes, I would love to. And I'll just preface, as a medieval scholar who reads religious literature, I come across a lot of prayers in the past. And I love to collect these prayers. In fact, when one of my graduate students had cancer not too long ago. And so we collected all these prayers for her, what Christians have done in the past, prayed in the past. And one of my favorites is one that I actually found when I was reading 16th century prayer books in the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. They have a lot of medieval and early modern manuscripts. And this one is a prayer book that possibly belongs to Lady Jane Grey, who, if you know your 16th century history, she was queen for 9 days and lost her head during the whole Reformation era. It was pretty ugly. And there is a prayer book that is reputed to belong to her. And many of the pages in it, it's actually very worn, where the pages have been turned down and some of it's spotty, and people say that was her tears that she prayed over it. Cool. And so one of her prayers that was on one of those turned down pages, it's a short prayer, but I think it's a great prayer for us to go with. So this is it. Okay. It says, God, be in our head and in our understanding. Be in our eyes and in our looking. Be in our mouth and in our speaking. Be in our hearts and in our thinking. At the end, blessed Lord, be with us in our living and in our departing. Amen.
Amen. Oh, thank you again, Beth. That was awesome. Appreciate it. All right. Well, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.